1,000 Tiny Sexes, Feminism and Rhizomatics. Deleuze and Guattari's work is rarely discussed in feminist writings, even in those explicitly oriented to what is popularly called French theory or French postmodernism. This omission is even more striking given the ready availability of English translations of most of their major, sole and collaborative works. Could it be that their work has little to offer feminist theory, or that feminists, even those working on French theory, have, for whatever reasons, simply not read them? Or that their work is difficult to read, to enter, and to feel at ease in, to use? This paper undertakes to provide a preliminary exploration of the theoretical terrain and some of the basic concepts in Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Volume 2, with the aim of seeing their possible value for feminist concerns, their potential to contest and reorient feminist commitments, and their utility, or otherwise, for feminist methodologies. 1. Feminist suspicions. Those feminists who have explicitly addressed Deleuze and Guattari's work have, in the main, tended to be rather critical, or at the very least suspicious, of the apparently masculine interests, orientations, and metaphors in their writings, worried about the models and images of machines, assemblages, planes, forces, energies, and connections they advocated, suspicious of their use of manifestly misogynist writers like Henry Miller and D.H. Lawrence, critical of an apparently phallic drive to plug things, make connections, link with things. If I may be permitted to quote myself from an earlier paper, this may help to capture some of the common feminist responses I have heard with regard to their work. Quote, "They exhibit a certain blindness to their own positions as masculine, not because they are men, but because they are blind to their own processes of production, their own positions as representatives of particular values and interests that are incapable of being universalized or erected into a neutral theoretical method. They have paid lip service to feminist interests in their advocacy of the processes of becoming marginal or becoming woman as part of their challenge to totalizing procedures, but they exhibit a certain blindness to feminine subjectivity, a feminist point of view, and the role of women in their characterizations of the world. They fail to notice that the process of becoming marginal or becoming woman means nothing as a strategy if one is already marginal or a woman. What they ignore is the question of sexual difference, sexual specificity, and autonomy." End quote. Expressed here are a series of reservations about the relevance of their work to questions of sexual differences. There is the claim that their work does not acknowledge its investments in masculine perspectives, the claim that they describe as neutral a position that is manifestly not neutral with respect to the specificity of female experience, and a refusal to accept that their use of the metaphor of woman, or becoming woman, has very real effects, not in the valorization of femininity, but, on the contrary, in its neutralization or neuterization. One of the few feminist theorists who has published material on Deleuze and Guattari, Alice Jardine, makes a similar series of charges against them in her text, Gynesis, where she claims, quote, "To the extent that women must become woman first, might that not mean that she must also be the first to disappear? Is it not possible that the process of becoming woman is but a new variation of an old allegory for the process of women becoming obsolete? They would remain only her simulacrum, a female figure caught in a whirling sea of male configurations, a silent, mutable, headless, desireless spatial surface necessary only for his metamorphosis." End quote. The suspicion that becoming woman, desiring machines, and other similar concepts are merely excuses for male forms of appropriation of whatever is radical and threatening about women's movements is also hinted at, though less directly and without specifically referring to Deleuze and Guattari by name, by Irigaray's writing as well. She claims that for women to accept Deleuzean models of desire, machinic functions, assemblages, and so on, is to once again subsume women under the neutralized masculinity of the phallocratic. Quote, "Doesn't the desiring machine still partly take the place of woman or the feminine? Isn't it a sort of metaphor for her that men can use, especially in terms of their relation to the technocratic? Or again, can this psychosis be woman's? If so, isn't it a psychosis that prevents them from acceding to sexual pleasure? At least to their pleasure. That is, to a pleasure different from an abstract, neuter pleasure of sexualized matter. That pleasure which perhaps constitutes a discovery for men as supplement to enjoyment in a phantasmatic becoming woman, but which has long been familiar to women. For them, isn't the body without organs a historical condition? And don't we run the risk once more of taking back from woman those as yet unterritorialized spaces where her desire might come into being, since women have long been assigned to the task of preserving body matter and the organless? Doesn't the body without organs, come to occupy the place of their own schism, of the evacuation of women's desire in women's body? To turn the body without organs into a cause of sexual pleasure, isn't it necessary to have had a relation to language and to sex, to the organs, that women have never had? End quote. Here, Irigaray voices a number of common feminist reservations about the Deleuzean project, which could be briefly listed in the following terms. 1. The metaphor of becoming woman is a male appropriation and recuperation of the positions and struggles of women. As such, it risks depoliticizing, possibly even aestheticizing struggles and political challenges that are crucial to the survival and self-definition of women. 2. Such metaphors serve to neutralize men's search for their own disillusion and reorganization, making the struggles around the question of becoming a human, or even more broadly, a universal, rather than a specifically masculine enterprise, thus participating in the kind of desexualization or despecification characteristic of phallocentric thought. 3. While it may be understood as a masculine appropriation of femininity, metaphors of becoming woman also, paradoxically, prevent women from exploring and interrogating their own specific and non-generalizable forms of becoming, desiring production, and being. 4. Like all phallocentric systems of thought, the Deleuzean project may, once again, be accused of simply using women as the ground, object, or excuse for his own involvement, using woman to obscure an examination of his own investments in women's subjugation. Woman, once again, becomes the object or the prop of man's speculations, self-reflections, and intellectual commitments. 5. To invoke the notion of becoming woman in place of a concept of being woman, Deleuze and Guattari participate in the subordination or possibly even the obliteration of women's struggles for autonomy, identity, and self-determination, an erasure of a certain very concrete and real set of political struggles which, if it were directed to, say, the struggles of other majority groups, women, of course, are not a minority, statistically speaking, would provoke horror and outrage. For example, for white middle-class men to invoke the metaphor of becoming black or becoming Hispanic would provoke scathing condemnation and great suspicion. 6. Deleuze and Guattari are invested in a romantic elevation of models of psychosis, schizophrenia, and madness that on the one hand ignore the very real pain and torment of such individuals and, on the other hand, elevate it to an unlivable, unviable ideal for others. Moreover, in making becoming woman the privileged site of all becomings, Deleuze and Guattari confirm a long historical association between femininity, women, and madness that ignores the sexually specific forms that madness takes, as Irigaray's own earliest researches have demonstrated. And 7. In invoking metaphors of machinic functioning, Deleuze and Guattari, like other masculinist philosophers, utilize models of metaphors which have been made possible only at the expense of women's exclusion and denigration. Technocracies, while not inherently masculinist, are so, de facto, insofar as they are historically predicated on women's exclusion. Admittedly, Irigaray, Jardine, and I, in my earlier text, were referring not to 1000 Plateaus, but to Deleuze and Guattari's earlier works, most notably Anti-Oedipus. In itself a very complex and highly specifically directed text, with a different orientation and different perspectives from those developed in their later text. But many of the concerns expressed in the preceding quotations may, with equal relevance, be directed towards 1000 Plateaus. It will be the task of this paper to explore whether in fact such reservations and suspicions are warranted regarding what Deleuze and Guattari call their rhizomatics, whether indeed rhizomatics may provide a powerful ally and theoretical resource for feminist challenges to the domination of philosophical paradigms, methods, and presumptions, that have governed the history of Western thought and have perpetuated, rationalized, and legitimated the erasure of women and women's contributions from cultural, sexual, and theoretical life. In other words, whether their work may be deemed patriarchal or phallocentric. No text, not even feminist texts, can in a sense be immune to this charge, insofar as the very categories, concepts, and methodologies available today are those spawned by this history. It may still serve as a powerful tool or weapon in feminist challenges to phallocentric thought. Insofar as feminist theory and Deleuzean rhizomatics share a common target, the reversal of Platonism, a reversal which problematizes the opposition so integral to Western thought between the ideal and the real, the original and the copy, the conceptual and the material, and ultimately the opposition between man and woman, it may in fact turn out that their provisional, guarded alliance may be of great strategic value. In this paper, I would like to temporarily suspend critical feminist judgment in order to enter into the projects articulated in Deleuze and Guattari's 1000 Plateaus. I would like to explore how this text might possibly be used by and for feminist theoretical projects, as it involves some commitment to their overarching framework, basic presuppositions, and central concepts. It will be necessary to outline a number of their major concepts and images which may be of relevance to feminists, especially those concerned with bodies, sexualities, pleasures, and desire. The body without organs, the desiring machine, becoming woman, and those of more general methodological relevance, such as the notions of rhizomatics, cartography, intensities, speed, planes. 2. Feminist conjunctions. There seem to be a number of prima facie reasons why, in spite of their apparently peripheral connections with feminist theory, nevertheless Deleuze and Guattari's writings may prove fruitful for various forms of feminist research. I would like to briefly indicate what these apparent congruities, points of overlap, and common interests may be, even if only schematically. This provisional and schematic overview, a first attempt to explore and navigate paths through the nomadic grounds they explore, is preliminary to a deeper investigation into their work. Like a number of their contemporaries, Deleuze and Guattari challenge and displace the centrality and pervasiveness of the structure of binary logic that has exerted a domination in Western philosophy since the time of Plato. Not only do they seek out alternatives to contest or bypass the metaphysical bases of Western philosophy, which Derrida terms logocentrism, the immediacy or givenness of presence, they seek to position metaphysical identities and theoretical models in a context which renders them merely effects or surface phenomena within a broader or differently conceived ontology or metaphysics. The systems of thought based on the centrality of the subject and the coherence of signification can be put to work in such a way that they are no longer privileged or causal terms, but effects or consequences of processes of sedimentation, the congealing or coagulation of processes, interrelations or machines of disparate components functioning in provisional alignment with each other to form a working ensemble. Given that it is impossible to ignore binarized or dichotomous thought, and yet, given that such theoretical paradigms and methodologies are deeply implicated in regimes of oppression and social subordination, of which the oppression of women is the starkest, any set of procedures, including rhizomatics, which seeks to problematize and render them anachronistic, may well be worth closer feminist inspection. As they claim, quote, "We employ a dualism of models only in order to arrive at a process that challenges all models. Each time, mental correctives are necessary to undo the dualisms we had no wish to construct, but through which we pass." End quote. For this reason, if for no other, their notions of rhizomatics, cartography, schizoanalysis, etc., like deconstruction or grammatology, are at least of indirect relevance to feminists. Even if their procedures and methods do not actively affirm or support feminist struggles around women's autonomy and self-determination, they may nevertheless help clear the ground of metaphysical concepts so that women may be able to devise their own knowledges and accounts of themselves and the world. In the second place, and also aligned with feminist challenges to prevailing forms of masculinism in philosophy, is their interest in the question of difference, a difference capable of being understood outside the dominance or regime of the one, the self-same, the imaginary play of mirrors and doubles, the structure of binary pairs in which what is different can be understood only as a variation or negation of identity. Deleuze claims to conceptualize difference in terms beyond what he claims are the four illusions of representation. identity, opposition, analogy, and resemblance. In conceptualizing a difference in and of itself, a difference which is not subordinated to identity or the same, they invoke two forms of energy and alignment, the processes of becoming and the notion of multiplicity, a becoming beyond the logic, constraints, and confines of being, and a multiplicity beyond the merely doubling or multi-centering of proliferating subjects. Quote, "It is only when the multiple is effectively treated as a substantive multiplicity that it ceases to have any relation to the one as subject or object, natural or spiritual reality, image and world. A multiplicity has neither subject nor object, only determinations, magnitudes, and dimensions that cannot increase in number without the multiplicity changing in nature." End quote. A multiplicity is not a pluralized notion of identity multiplied by n locations, but is rather an ever-changing, non-totalizable collectivity, an assemblage defined not by its abiding identity or principle of sameness over time, but through its capacity to undergo permutations and transformations, that is, its dimensionality. Quote, "Multiplicities are defined by the outside, by the abstract line, the line of flight or deterritorialization according to which they change in nature and connections with other multiplicities." End quote. While the notion of becoming has proved an enormously fertile ground for a surprisingly large number of post-Nietzschean thinkers, Derrida, Irigaray, and Levinas, to name but a few, it has functioned to provide a non-teleological notion of direction, movement, and process, part of a Heraclitian tradition, and strongly associated with the model of the Hegelian dialectic. In Deleuze's writings, it has stronger affinities with the pre-Socratics, with Spinoza, and with the post-Nietzscheans than it may have in the texts of other contemporary French philosophers. However, exactly how such notions of multiplicity and becoming function in Deleuze's work, and how they may or may not be of use in feminist challenges to the structure of binary oppositions, to the formalized notions of identity or equivalence that have been used to define and exclude women, remains an open question, one to be explored in further detail beyond the limited confines of this paper. In the third place, there seems to be an evident allegiance between Deleuze and Guattari's notions of political struggle as decentered, molecular, multiple struggles, diversified, non-aligned, or aligned in only provisional or temporary networks, in non-hierarchical, rhizomatic connections, taking place at those sites where repression or anti-production is most intense, and feminist conceptions of and practices surrounding political struggle. In a sense, it could be argued that the Deleuzian, Foucaultian understanding of politics theorizes in a clearer and more direct form than rival or alternative political philosophies, including Marxism, socialism, liberalism, and anarchism, the kinds of theoretical and political struggles in which feminists are involved. Such struggles cannot be conceived simply as collectivized or group actions. They imply notions of the collectivity or multiplicity and the group that have not, before Deleuze and Guattari, been adequately theorized. Struggles occur not only in group-sized multiplicities, but also in those multiplicities internal to or functional through and across subjects, within subjects, against the control of the ego and the superego, against processes of edipalization which will enable a proliferation of becomings and the production of marginalities of all kinds. In short, their understanding of micropolitics, their affirmation of localized, concrete, non-representative struggles without leaders, without hierarchical organizations, without a clear-cut program or blueprint for social change, without definitive goals and ends, confirms and indeed borrows from already existing forms of feminist political struggle, even if it rarely acknowledges this connection. In the fourth place, their notion of the body as a discontinuous, non-totalized series of processes, organs, flows, energies, corporeal substances, and incorporeal events, intensities, durations, may be of great relevance to those feminists attempting to reconceive bodies, especially women's bodies outside of the binary polarizations imposed on the body by the mind-body, nature-culture, subject-object, and interior-exterior oppositions. They provide an altogether different understanding of the body than those which have dominated the history of Western thought, ways of understanding how the human body is linked to other bodies, human and non-human, animate and inanimate, linking organs and biological processes to material objects and social practices, while refusing to subordinate the body to a unity and homogeneity provided either by the body's subordination to consciousness or to organic organization. Following Spinoza, the body is regarded neither as a locus for a conscious subject, nor as an organically determined object. Instead, like the book itself, the body is analyzed and assessed more in terms of what it can do, the things it can perform, the linkages it establishes, the transformations it undergoes, and the machinic connections it forms with other bodies, what it can link with, how it can proliferate its capacities. A rare, affirmative understanding of the body. Quote, Spinoza's question, what is the body capable of? What affects is it capable of? Affects are becomings. Sometimes they weaken us to the extent they diminish our strength of action and decompose our relations. Sadness. Sometimes they make us stronger through augmenting our force and making us enter into a vaster and higher individual. Joy. Spinoza never ceases to be astonished at the body, not having a body, but at what the body is capable of. Bodies are not defined by their genus and species, nor by their organs and functions, but by what they can do, the affects they are capable of, in passion as in action. End quote. The notion of the body without organs, BWO, will also be explored in more detail later in this paper. But at least at first glance, feminist theorists need to devise alternative accounts of corporeality that go beyond the confines of the mind-body polarization, if women's specificity is to be rethought, and the domination of phallocentric representations is to be overcome. If this means turning to philosophers whose work has in the past been vilified or treated as suspect by feminists, as has Nietzsche's work, not to mention Deleuze's, this seems to me to be a risk worth taking, given the enormous theoretical stakes invested in reconceptualizing the body, and with it, subjectivity, in attempting to rethink the relations between man and woman in social relations. In the fifth place, just as Deleuze and Guattari provide alternative notions of the body to those usually dominant in Western thought, so too they have reconsidered the notion of desire in active and affirmative terms. It has been plausibly argued that in the tradition reaching from Plato to Lacan and beyond, desire has been understood largely as negative, abyssal, a lack at the level of ontology itself. This was most ably articulated in Hegel's understanding of the lack of object of desire, being the necessary condition for the maintenance of desire, a lack in being which strives to be filled through the impossible attainment of an object, the object for man being presumably the attainment or possession of woman, woman as the perennial object of man's desire, though without a congruous desire herself. For woman to have desire is to posit her on the same ontological level as man, a theoretical impossibility in phallocentric texts, hence the enigmatic and perpetual question of woman's desire. What does woman want? Instead of understanding desire as a lack or a hole in being, desire is understood by Deleuze, again following Spinoza and Nietzsche, as immanent, as positive and productive, a fundamental, full and creative relation. Desire is what produces, what makes things, forges connections, creates relations, produces machinic alignments. Instead of aligning desire with fantasy and opposing it to the real, as psychoanalysis does, for Deleuze, desire is what produces the real. Instead of a yearning, desire is an actualization, a series of practices, action, production, bringing together components, making machines, making reality. Desire is a relation of effectuation, not of satisfaction. Since Plato, desire has been conceived under the dominance of the subject and the sign. Whether the subject is conceived in terms of consciousness and ideas, as in Plato or Hegel, or the unconscious, as in Freud and Lacan, desire is that yearning to fill in, to reproduce a lost plenitude, whether the plenitude of the idea or that of the pre-edible. So, too, desire must transform itself into signification. For Lacan, it is the lack constitutive of desire that propels the subject into the order of signification, which, in its turn, marks the subject with a lack impossible to fill. This is the advent of demand from the order of the real. It seeks its various satisfactions of the same order, governed by a master signifier, the phallus, always and only at the level of representations, whether in hallucinatory form, the dream as the fulfillment of desire, or in the form of verbalized free associations. Desire is then a property of the subject. It is enacted through representations and is thwarted or frustrated by the real. By contrast, for Deleuze and Guattari, following Spinoza, Platonism is inverted, if not reversed. Desire is primary and given rather than lack. It is not produced, an effect of frustration or ontological lack, but is primitive and primary, not opposed to or postdating reality, but productive of reality. Desire does not take for itself a particular object whose attainment it requires. Rather, it aims at nothing in particular above and beyond its own proliferation or self-expansion. It assembles things out of singularities, and it breaks down things, assemblages, into their singularities. If desire produces, its product is real. If desire is productive, it can be so in reality and of reality. As production, desire does not provide blueprints, models, ideals, or goals. Rather, it experiments, it makes. It is fundamentally aleatory. It is bricolage. Such a notion of desire cannot but be of interest to feminist theory, insofar as women have been the traditional repositories and guardians of the lack constitutive of Platonic desire, and insofar as the opposition between presence and lack, between reality and fantasy, has traditionally defined and constrained women to inhabit the place of man's other. Lack only makes sense to the male subject insofar as some other woman personifies and quite literally embodies it for him. Any model of desire that dispenses with its reliance on the primacy of lack seems to be a positive step forward, and for that reason alone worthy of careful consideration. And, in the sixth place, through their elaboration of a basically Spinozist framework, Deleuze and Guattari resurrect the question of the centrality of ethics, of the encounter with otherness, in a way that may prove highly pertinent to feminist attempts to rethink relations between the mainstream and the margins, between dominant and subordinated groups, and between oppressor and oppressed, self and other, between and within subjects. Here, ethics is no longer conceived on the basis of an abstract system of moral rules and obligations, such as proposed by Kantian or Christian morality, that is, in terms of moral prescriptions and imperatives, nor in opposition to conceptions of politics, as it commonly has in, for example, Marxist theory. Rather, they are participants in what might be described as the advent of a postmodern ethics, an ethics posed in the light of the dissolution of the rational, judging subject or contract-based liberal accounts of the individual's allegiance to the social community. In the wake of a Spinozist understanding of ethics, ethics is conceived of as the capacity for action and passion. Activity and passivity, good and bad, refer to the ability to increase or decrease one's capacities, strengths, and abilities. Given the vast and necessary interrelation and mutual affectivity and effectivity of all beings on all others, a notion, incidentally, still very far opposed to the rampant moralism underlying ecological and environmental politics, which also stresses interrelations, but does so in a necessarily prescriptive and judgmental fashion, presuming notions of unity, wholeness, integration, and cooperation, rather than, as do Deleuze and Guattari, simply describing interrelations and connections without subordinating them to an overarching order, system, or totality. The question of ethics is raised whenever the question of a being's or an assemblage's capacities and abilities are raised. Unlike Levinasian ethics, which is still modeled on a subject-to-subject, self-to-other relation, the relation of a being respected in its autonomy and the other, as a necessarily independent autonomous being, the culmination and final flowering of a phenomenological notion of subject, Deleuze and Guattari in no way privilege the human, autonomous, sovereign subject, or the independent other, and the bonds of communication and representation between them. They are concerned more with what psychoanalysis calls partial objects, organs, processes, flows, which show no respect for the autonomy of the subject. Ethics is the sphere of judgments regarding the possibilities and actuality of connections, arrangements, linkages, machines. Quote, all individuals exist in nature as on a plan of consistence whose entire figure, variable at each moment, they go to compose. They affect one another insofar as the relation that constitutes each individual forms a degree of power, puissance, a power of being affected. Everything in the universe is encounters, happy or unhappy encounters. End note. There are then at least these points of shared interest, of potential interaction and linkage between the Deleuzian project and those designated as feminist. This is not to say that an alliance between feminism and Deleuzianism is possible or even fruitful, nor even that they may be able to offer each other new insights or methods. Rather, not only are there possible conjunctions and interactions, but also possible points of disjunction, of disruption, of mutually questioning, that may prove as fruitful as any set of alignments or a coalition of interests. 3. Rhizomatics, multiplicity, and becoming. In this and the following section, I will concentrate on a relatively small cluster of concepts which I believe may overlap with feminist interests. The notions of rhizome, assemblage, machine, desire, multiplicity, becoming, and the body without organs. As I understand them, these concepts are linked together as part of the schizoanalytic project of rejecting or displacing prevailing centrisms, unities, and rigid strata. In order to adequately understand their apparently idiosyncratic contributions which very commonly appeared hermetically sealed to the outsider or the uninitiated, ridden with jargon and with a mysteriously ineffable systematicity, it is necessary to let go of a number of preconceptions and inherited conceptual schemes of notions of subjectivity and conventional modes of explanation. In Deleuze and Guattari's work, the subject is not an entity or thing, or a relation between mind, interior, and body, exterior. Instead, it must be understood as a series of flows, energies, movements, capacities, a series of fragments or segments capable of being linked together in ways other than those which congeal it into an identity. Production consists in those processes which create linkages between fragments of bodies and fragments of objects. And machines are heterogeneous, disparate, discontinuous assemblages of fragments brought together in conjunctions, X plus Y plus Z, or severed through disjunctions and breaks, a concept not unlike a complex form of bricolage or tinkering described by Levi-Strauss. A desiring machine opposes the notion of unity or one. The elements or discontinuities which compose it do not belong to either an original totality that has been lost, Plato or Freud, nor to one which finalizes or completes it, a telos, Hegel. They are multiplicities of more or less temporary alignments of segments. They do not represent the real, they are the real. They constitute, without distinction, individual, collective, and social reality. Desire does not create permanent multiplicities, which would produce what is stable, self-identical, the same. It experiments rather than standardizes, producing ever new alignments, linkages, and connections. Rhizomatics, or schizoanalysis, does not study the coagulations of entities, the massifications of diverse flows and intensities, but lines of flow and flight, trajectories of territorialization, deterritorialization, and reterritorialization. Probably the clearest characteristic of this project comes from the introductory plateau of 1,000 Plateaus, called Rhizome. Here Deleuze and Guattari make explicit that their project has nothing to do with conventional modes of explanation, interpretation, and analysis. They refuse the domination of linguistic, literary, semiological models, which all seek some kind of hidden depth underneath a manifest surface. Rather, they are interested precisely in connections, in interrelations, which are never hidden. Connections not between a text and its meaning, but, say, a text and other objects, a text and its outside. Quote, "We shall never ask what a book, signifier, and signified means. We shall not look for anything to understand in a book. Instead, we shall wonder with what it functions, in connection with what it transmits, intensities or doesn't, into what multiplicities it introduces and metamorphoses its own, with what body, without organs, it makes its own converge. A book only exists by means of an outside, a beyond. Thus, a book being itself a little machine, what measurable relationship does this literary machine have, in turn, with a war machine, a love machine, a revolutionary machine, etc.? End quote. Writing, they suggest, has nothing to do with signifying. It has to do with surveying, mapping, even realms that are yet to come. It is thus no longer appropriate to ask what a text means, what it says, the structure of its interiority, how to interpret or decipher it. Instead, one must ask what it does, how it connects with other things, including its reader, its author, its literary and non-literary context. Rhizomatics opposes itself to both what they call the tree image and the root image. The tree metaphor is an emblem of linear, progressive, ordered systems. Presumably, it dates from the ideal model of argument derived from Greek philosophy, now known as Porphyry's tree, which functions through the operation of disjunctive syllogism. The root metaphor also presumes a unity, but like the root itself, this unity is hidden or latent, and thus may present itself as if it were decentered or non-unified. Unlike the manifest unity of the tree, the unity of the root is more hidden, a kind of nostalgia for a lost past or an anticipated future. In opposition to both of these models of a text, Deleuze and Guattari use the metaphor of the rhizome, an underground but perfectly manifest network of multiple branching roots and shoots with no central axis, no unified point of origin, and no given direction of growth. A proliferating, somewhat chaotic and diversified system of growths. Quote, the rhizome is reducible neither to the one nor the multiple. It is not a multiple derived from the one, or to which the one is added, n plus one. It is composed not of units, but of dimensions, or rather directions in motion. It has neither beginning nor end, but always a middle, from which it grows and which it overspills. It constitutes linear multiplicities with n dimensions having neither subject nor object, and from which the one is always subtracted, n minus one. Unlike a structure, which is defined by a set of points and positions, with binary relations between points and bi-univocal relationships between the positions, the rhizome is made only of lines of segmentarity and stratification as its dimensions. The rhizome operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, offshoots. The rhizome is an a-centered, non-hierarchical, non-signifying system. End quote. The rhizome may be summarily described in the following terms. 1. It is based on connection, bringing together diverse fragments, not only different theories, but also theories with objects and practices. 2. It is based on heterogeneity. These multiple connections are not massified linkages, but also microlinkages, which bring together very diverse domains, levels, dimensions, functions, effects, aims, and objects. 3. It is based on multiplicity. Multiplicity here does not mean a multiplicity of singularities, of ones, a repetition of the self-same, but a genuine proliferation of processes that are neither ones nor twos. 4. It is based on ruptures, breaks, and discontinuities. Any one of the rhizome's connections is capable of being severed or disconnected, creating the possibility of other, different connections. And 5. It is based on cartography. Not a reproduction or tracing, model making or paradigm construction, but map making or experimentation. Quote, the rhizome is altogether different, a map and not a tracing. Make a map, not a tracing. The orchid does not reproduce the tracings of the wasp, it forms a map with the wasp, in a rhizome. What distinguishes the map from the tracing is that it is entirely oriented toward an experimentation in contact with the real. The map does not reproduce an unconscious closed in upon itself. It constructs the unconscious. The map is open and connectable in all of its dimensions. It is detachable, reversible, susceptible to constant modification. It can be torn, reversed, adapted to any kind of mounting, reworked by any individual, group, or social formation. A map has multiple entryways, as opposed to the tracing, which always comes back to the same. The map has to do with performance, whereas the tracing always involves an alleged competence. The tracing should always be put back on the map. End quote. Rhizomatics, then, is a name for a method and an objective. It names a decentered set of linkages between things, relations, processes, intensities, speed or slowness, flows, proliferations of surface connections. In this sense, rhizomatics is opposed to hermeneutics, psychoanalysis, and semiotics, each of which seeks, in its different way, to link an object, a text, a subject, a sign, with a hidden depth or latency. Sense, the unconscious, the signified. Rhizomatics is a form of pragmatics. It is concerned with what can be done, how texts, concepts, and subjects can be put to work, made to do things, making new linkages. Pivotal concepts within a rhizomatic cartography are the notions of the body without organs and becoming woman, to which I will now turn. 4. Bodies without organs and becomings. Their notion of the BWO constitutes Deleuze and Guattari's attempt to both denaturalize the human body and to place it in direct relations with the flows or particles of other bodies or entities. In relying on a Spinozist conception of the univocity of being, in which all things, regardless of their type, have the same ontological status, the BWO refers indistinguishably to human, animal, textual, socio-cultural, and physical bodies, rather than, as psychoanalysis does, regarding the body as the developmental union or aggregate of partial objects, organs, drives, bits, each with their own significance, each with their own pleasures, which are, through edibilization, brought into line with the body's organic unity. Deleuze and Guattari instead invoke Antonin Artaud's conception of the body without organs. This is the body disinvested of all fantasies, images, projections, a body without a psychical interior, without internal cohesion or latent significance. Deleuze and Guattari speak of it as a surface of intensities before it is stratified, organized, hierarchized. The BWO is not a body evacuated of a psychical interiority. Rather, it is a limit or a tendency to which all bodies aspire. Deleuze and Guattari speak of it as an egg, a surface of intensities, before it is stratified, organized, and hierarchized. It lacks depth or internal organization, and can instead be regarded as a flow, or the arresting of a flow, of intensities. Quote, the BWO causes intensities to pass. It produces and distributes them in a spatium that is itself intensive, lacking extension. It is non-stratified, unformed, intense matter. That is why we treat the BWO as the full egg before the extension of the organism and the organization of the organs, before the formation of strata. End quote. The BWO does not oppose or reject organs, but rather is opposed to the structure or organization of the bodies, the body insofar as it is stratified, regulated, ordered, and functional, insofar as it is subordinated to the exigencies of property and propriety. It is the body before and in excess of the coalescence of its intensities and their sedimentation into meaningful, functional, organized, transcendent totalities, which constitute the unification of the subject and of signification. Deleuze and Guattari regard the BWO as a limit, a tendency, a becoming which resists centralized organization or meaningful investment, a point or process to which all bodies, through their stratifications, tend, a becoming which resists the converse processes of overcoding or organization according to the three great strata or identities it opposes, the union of the organism, the unification of the subject, and the structure of significance. The BWO resists any equation with a notion of identity or property. The BWO is never yours or mine. It is always a body. They distinguish between two kinds of BWOs. The emptied BWO exemplified by the drug addict, the masochist, and the hypochondriac, and the full BWO in and through which intensities circulate and flow, where powers, energies, and productions are engendered. In the case of the emptied BWO, the body is not only evacuated of organs and forms of organization, but also of its intensities and forces. The hypochondriac, for example, destroys both organs and the flow of matter and intensities. The masochist's BWO is a body sewn up, smothered, filled only with what they call pain waves. The junkie's BWO is filled, by contrast, with refrigerator waves. the cold. Quote, a junkie wants the cold like he wants his junk, not outside where it does him no good, but inside so he can sit around with a spine like a frozen hydraulic jack, his metabolism approaching absolute zero. Burroughs, The Naked Lunch. End quote. The empty BWO does not deny a becoming, rather it establishes a line of flight that is unable to free the circulation of intensities, making other further connections with other BWOs possible. It is a line of flight that ends in its own annihilation. Quote, instead of making a body without organs sufficiently rich or full for the passage of intensities, drug addicts erect a vitrified or emptied body, or a cancerous one. The causal line, creative line, or line of flight immediately turns into a line of death and abolition. End quote. While being neither a place nor a plane, nor a scene nor a fantasy, the BWO is a field for the production, circulation, and intensification of desire, the locus of the immanence of desire. Although it is the field for the circulation of intensities, and although it induces deterritorializations and lines of flight, movements of becoming, the ability to sustain itself is the condition that seems to be missing in the empty BWO. There must, it seems, be a minimal level of cohesion and integration in the BWO in order to prevent its obliteration. There must be small pockets of subjectivity and signification left in order for the BWO's survival facing the onslaughts of power and reality. A complete de-stratification renders even the BWO non-functional. Quote, you have to keep enough of the organism for it to reform each dawn, and you have to keep small supplies of significance and subjectification, if only to turn them against their own systems when the circumstances demand it, when things, persons, even situations force you to. And you have to keep small rations of subjectivity in sufficient quantity to enable you to respond to the dominant reality, mimic the strata. You don't reach the BWO and its plane of consistency by wildly de-stratifying. That is why we encountered the paradox of those emptied and dreary bodies at the very beginning. They had emptied themselves of their organs, instead of looking for the point at which they could patiently and momentarily dismantle the organization of the organs we call the organism. End quote. De-stratification, freeing lines of flight, the production of connections, the movements of intensities and flows through and beyond the BWO, is thus a trajectory or tendency rather than a fixed state or final position. They do not advocate a dissolution of identity, a complete destabilization and defamiliarization of identity, rather micro-destratifications, intensifications of some interactions, but not necessarily all. Quote, staying stratified, organized, signified, subjected, is not the worst that can happen. The worst that can happen is that you throw the strata into demented or suicidal collapse, which brings them back down on us, heavier than ever. End quote. The BWO is the field of becomings. Becoming, woman, animal, imperceptible, is, in feminist terms, perhaps the most controversial element of their work. In order to know what a body is, it is vital to know what it is capable of, what its energies are, what relations it establishes, and what interactions and effects it has on other bodies. The body cannot be conceived as a block, an entity, an object or a subject, an organized and integrated being. In order to make the body more amenable to transformations, realignments, reconnections with other BWOs, there are struggles within the body which require recognition. As Deleuze and Guattari distinguished the BWO from the body's organization as a singular, unified, organic, and psychical totality, so too they distinguish between molar and molecular forms of subjectivity, minoritarian and majoritarian collective groupings. Becomings are always molecular, traversing and realigning molar unities. Quote, if we consider the great binary aggregates, such as the sexes or classes, it is evident that they also cross over into molecular assemblages of a different nature, and that there is a double reciprocal dependency between them. For the two sexes imply a multiplicity of molecular combinations, bringing into play not only the man in the woman and the woman in the man, but the relation of each to the animal, the plant, etc. 1,000 tiny sexes. If molar unities, like the divisions of classes, races, and sexes, attempt to form and stabilize an identity, a fixity, a system that functions homeostatically, sealing in its energies and intensities, molecular becomings traverse, create a path, destabilize, enable energy seepage within and through these molar unities. In his paper Politics, Deleuze makes a distinction between three types of line relevant to understanding the nexus between the individual and the social. First, there is the rigidly segmented line, the line that divides, orders, hierarchizes, and regulates social relations through binary codes, creating the oppositions between sexes, classes, and races, and dividing the real into subject and objects. This is a stratifying or molar line. Second, there is a more fluid molecular line which forms connections and relations beyond the rigidity of the molar line. It is composed of fluid lines which map processes of becoming, change, movement, reorganization. While it is not in itself revolutionary, if it is still meaningful today to say this, it accounts for both socio-political and micro-becomings, demassifying molar segmentations, creating overcoded territories, passages, or cracks between segments so that they may drift, and yet something pass between them. And third, there is a more nomadic line, not always clearly distinguishable from the molecular line, which moves beyond given segments in destinations unknown in advance, lines of flight, mutations, even quanta leaps. Thus, if the division, the binary opposition between the sexes, or for that matter, the global system of patriarchy, can be considered molar lines of segmentation, then the process of becoming woman, for both men and women, consists in the releasing of minoritarian fragments or particles of sexuality. Sexuality no longer functions on the level of the unified, genitalized organization of the sexed body. Lines of flight which break down and seep into binary aggregations. But this process of the multiplication of sexualities is only a step in the creation of a nomadic line, a line of becoming imperceptible which disaggregates the molar structures. If the BWO never belongs to a subject nor functions simply as an object, if it is never yours or mine, but simply a BWO, then becomings, by contrast, are never generic, never indeterminate. They are always becoming something. Becomings are always specific movements, specific forms of motion and rest, speed and slowness, points and flows of intensity. They are always a multiplicity, the movement of transformation from one thing to another, which in no way resembles it. Captain Ahab becomes whale, Willard becomes rat, Hans becomes horse, the wolfman becomes wolf. These are not based on the human's imitation of the animal, a resemblance with the animal, a mimicry of the animal's behavior, or, by contrast, of the animal's ability to represent the subject's fantasies or psychical significances, its metaphoric or symbolic relation to the subject. Deleuze and Guattari suggest that becomings, and especially becoming animal, involve a mediating third term, a relation to something else, neither human nor animal, to which the subject relates, and through which relation it enters into connections with the animal. Quote, an example, do not imitate a dog, but make your organism enter into composition with something else in such a way that the particles emitted from the aggregate thus composed will be canine as a function of the relations of movement and rest, or of molecular proximity into which they enter. Clearly, this something else can be quite varied and be more or less directly related to the animal in question. It can be the animal's natural food, dirt and worm, or its exterior relations with other animals. You can become dog with cats, or become monkey with a horse, or an apparatus or prosthesis to which a person subjects the animal, muzzle or reindeer, etc., or something that does not have a localizable relation to the animal in question. We have seen how Slepian bases his attempt to become dog on the idea of tying shoes to his hands using his mouth muzzle. End quote. While becoming animal is a major line of flight from identity, the mode of becoming most privileged in their writings is becoming woman, through which, they claim, all other becomings are made possible, although why this is so is never clearly explained by them. Quote, although all becomings are already molecular, including becoming woman, it must be said that all becomings begin with and pass through becoming woman. It is the key to all other becomings. End quote. This process of becoming woman, while never specified, cannot be based on any recognition, identification with, or imitation of women as molar entities. It is for this reason, they claim, that not only must men become woman, but so too must women. Presumably this means that for women, as much as for men, the process of becoming woman is the destabilization of molar, feminine identity. Quote, what we term a molar entity is, for example, the woman as defined by her form, endowed with organs and functions, and assigned as a subject. Becoming woman is not imitating this entity, or even transforming oneself into it, not imitating or assuming the female form, but emitting particles that enter the relation of movement and rest, or the zone of proximity of a micro-femininity. In other words, that produce in us a molecular woman. End quote. They explain that they are not here advocating the development of any form of bisexuality. For them, bisexuality is simply an internalization of binarized sexuality, the miniaturization of the great molar polarities of the sexes without in any way contesting them. Becoming woman disengages the segments and constraints of the molar entity in order to reinvest and be able to use other particles, flows, speeds, and intensities of the BWO. This enables them, paradoxically, to suggest that even the most phallocentric and notorious male writers, they mention Lawrence and Miller, have in their writings become woman, or relied on processes of becoming woman, a statement whose validity remains problematic from a feminist point of view. While it may be argued, as they do, that writers like Virginia Woolf produce such texts, and while it is plausible to claim, as Kristeva does, that men too can, with certain risks to their masculine phallic position, write as women, Joyce, Mallarmé, Artaud, etc., it remains considerably less convincing to hold up the most notoriously phallic and misogynist writers to exemplify this mode of becoming. Quote, when Virginia Woolf was questioned about a specifically woman's writing, she was appalled at the idea of writing as a woman. Rather, writing should produce a becoming woman as atoms of womanhood capable of crossing and impregnating an entire social field, and of contaminating men, of sweeping them up in that becoming. The rise of women in English novel writing has spared no man. Even those who pass for the most virile, the most phallocratic, such as Lawrence and Miller, in their turn, continually tap into and emit particles that enter into the proximity or zones of indiscernibility of women. In writing, they become women. The question is not, or not only, that of the organism, history, and subject of enunciation that oppose masculine to feminine in the great dualism machines. The question is fundamentally that of the body they steal from us in order to fabricate opposable organs. End quote. It is never clear who is the they and who is the we referred to here. If this description is appropriate, and it is not entirely clear to me how appropriate it is, then to become woman, writers like Miller and Lawrence must steal the body, or something of the body, of women. But then, in what ways is this in any sense critical of, rather than simply affirmative of, men's patriarchal exploitations of women? In what way does this contest ameliorate or act as restitution of the robbery of women's bodies by men in the service of their goals, interests, machines, and habitual power positions? This question is clearly linked to a series of others. Why is woman, or child or animal, privileged, at least in name, in the advocacy of becoming? If women too need to become woman, and children need to become child, then why refer at all to women and children? Why not simply explain it in terms of the more general trajectory of becoming, the non-organic, asubjective, and a-signifying becoming imperceptible? Is this another form of the phallic appropriation and exploitation of women, and femininity as the object of male speculation and systems building? Where does it leave women in relation to men, and children in relation to adults? What effects do such characterizations have on the great molar divisions between ages and sexes? In other words, what are its short and long-term political effects? To be fair to Deleuze and Guattari, they do attempt to clear up some of these confusions, although it remains unclear how successful they are. They describe all processes of becoming as minoritarian, as molecular, rather than as majoritarian and molar. The minority is not a quantitative concept. It refers only to molecular processes, while the majority refers to the great divisions of groups in terms of prevailing power relations. Quote, majority implies a state of domination, not the reverse. It is perhaps the special situation of women in relation to the man standard that accounts for the fact that becomings, being minoritarian, always pass through a becoming woman. It is important not to confuse minoritarian, as becoming or process, with a minority, as an aggregate or a state. There is no becoming man, because man is the molar entity par excellence, whereas becomings are molecular. End quote. Becoming woman involves a series of processes and movements outside of or beyond the fixity of subjectivity and the structure of stable unities. It is an escape from the systems of binary polarization that privilege men at the expense of women. In this sense, even if in no other, Deleuze and Guattari's work is clearly of some value to feminist theory. However, it then becomes clear that exactly what becoming woman means or entails is different for the two sexes. For man, it implies a and restructuring of their sexuality, the bringing into play of microfemininities, behaviors, impulses, and actions that may have been repressed or blocked in their development. But exactly what it means for women remains unspecified. Deleuze and Guattari state that for women to become woman does not mean renouncing feminist struggles for the attainment of a self-determined molar identity and taking up a different path. The paths of becoming can only function, as they claim, through a relative stability afforded by subjective identity and signification. Quote, it is, of course, indispensable for women to conduct a molar politics with a view to winning back their own organism, their own history, their own subjectivity. But it is dangerous to confine oneself to such a subject which does not function without drying up a spring or stopping a flow. Becoming woman means going beyond identity and subjectivity, fragmenting and freeing up lines of flight, liberating 1,000 tiny sexes that identity subsumes under the one. Deleuze and Guattari imply that man's becoming woman is contingent upon woman's, that her becoming woman is the condition of his. Quote, a woman has to become woman, but in a becoming woman of all men. A becoming minoritarian exists only by virtue of a deterritorialized medium and subject that are like its elements. There is no subject of becoming except as a deterritorialized variable of a minority. There is no medium of becoming except as a deterritorialized variable of a minority. End quote. If becoming woman is the medium through which all becomings must pass, it is, however, only a provisional becoming, or a stage in a trajectory or movement which takes as its end the most microscopic and fragmenting of processes, which they describe as becoming imperceptible. This becoming is the breakdown of all identities, molar and molecular, majoritarian and minoritarian, the freeing of infinitely microscopic lines, a process whose end is achieved only with complete dissolution, the production of the incredible shrinking man. Quote, if becoming woman is the first quantum or molecular segment with the becomings animal that link up with it coming next, what are they all rushing toward? Without a doubt, toward becoming imperceptible. The imperceptible is the imminent end of becoming, its cosmic formula. For example, Matheson's shrinking man passes through the kingdoms of nature, slips between molecules, to become an unfindable particle in infinite meditation on the infinite. End quote. There is then a kind of progression in becomings, an order or system, in which becoming woman is, for all subjects, a first step, preceded by becoming animal, and then towards becoming imperceptible. Indiscernibility, imperceptibility, and impersonality remain the endpoints of becoming, their imminent, direct, or internal impetus, the freeing of absolutely minuscule micro-intensities to the nth degree. Establishing an identity as a woman is thus only setting the stage for the processes of becoming woman. Becoming woman is the condition of human becomings. Human becomings, in turn, must deterritorialize and become animal. The chain of becomings follows the traditional scientific order of being from the most complicated organic forms, through the animal world to inorganic matter, down to the smallest point or quantum of energy, the sub-subatomic particle. Such formulae in which the liberation of woman is merely a stage or stepping stone in a broader struggle must be viewed with great suspicion. These are common claims, claims which have been used to tie women to struggles that in fact have very little to do with them, or rather to which women have been tied through a generalized humanity, which is in fact a projection or representation of men's specific fantasies about what it is to be human. The Marxist subordination of women's struggles to the class struggle, this assumption of women's call for identities as women under the general call for the dissolution of all identities, Kristeva and Derrida, the positing of women's pleasures and desires as the means of access to the other, Lacan and Levinas, the establishment of animal liberation shortly after women's liberation, all serve as relatively current examples of such phallocentrism. It is not something to which women are immune either. The fact that women perpetrate this maneuver is a function of the uncritical internalization of perspectives and interests devised and developed by men. This means, at the least, that feminists need to be wary of Deleuze and Guattari's work, as wary as of any theoretical framework or methodology. But it clearly does not mean that their work needs to be shunned, avoided, or ignored because of some risk of patriarchal contagion. After all, in spite of more and more subtle forms of political appropriation of women and femininity enacted by Marxism, psychoanalytic theory, deconstruction, and all other forms of theory, nevertheless, feminist theory is considerably richer because of its encounters and alliances with these theories than it would have been without them. There is no doubt that Rhizomatics has something of importance to offer feminists, if it does not actually augment them, which in any case would imply some kind of theoretical commensurability, then at least it may imply both a complementarity, and it may also force critical reevaluations of the forms of struggles that women have undertaken and will undertake against their containment within phallocentric discourses, knowledges, and representations. Deleuze and Guattari's work raises a number of crucial questions about the political investments of specific positions within feminism, liberal, Marxist, and socialist forms, which can be seen to participate in a molarization, a process of reterritorialization, a sedimentation of women's possibilities of becoming. It provides a mode of analysis and contestation of the ontological commitments and intellectual frameworks of models of knowledge that must surely be of some interest and value to feminists, insofar as it is experimental, innovative, and self-consciously political. Its concrete and specific value must remain an open question. This depends entirely on what feminists are able to do utilizing their work in the future, what systems of desire it can function to produce, what networks or machines of power it can serve to support or destabilize. The more varied, the bolder such feminist thought experiments may be, the easier it will become to assess their value for feminist theory. But there must remain a wariness, insofar as they too sever becoming woman from being woman, and make the specificities of becoming woman crucial to men's quest for self-expansion. They render women's becomings, their subversions, their minoritarian and marginal struggles, subordinate to a cosmic becoming imperceptible, which amounts, in effect, to a political obliteration or marginalization of women's struggles.